Today, we are diving deep into the massive and, frankly, fascinating world of the illicit drug trade. We're going to use data and analysis from the early 2000s to really break down how a $400 billion global industry can even operate in the shadows. So, let's jump right in.
So to really get a handle on the stakes here, check this out. 5 grams. That's it. We're talking about the weight of just 6 M&Ms. But under federal law back then, selling that tiny amount of crack cocaine meant a mandatory 5 years in prison. It's a crazy powerful analogy that just immediately shows you the scale of the risk involved.
And that right there, that's the whole game. You've got a world where a product that weighs about as much as a few pieces of candy could cost you a huge chunk of your life. This sets up the central tension of the entire drug trade. Absolutely immense personal risk, but on the other side, the potential for an incredible financial reward.
So let's really dig into that gamble. What does that balance of risk and reward actually look like for the people who are in this trade? This table just lays it all out, and it is stark. We're looking at the federal penalties for trafficking cocaine powder at the time. A first offense, for a little over a pound, mandatory 5 years. A second offense, this time with over 11 pounds, that jumps to a minimum of 20 years behind bars. And a third conviction, for any amount at all, meant mandatory life. The message from the legal system couldn't be clearer. The risks were absolutely astronomical.
But then you've got the other side of that coin. This quote from a United Nations report is just stunning. It says that traffickers could have up to 30% of their entire product seized by law enforcement, and it would barely make a dent in the street price. The profit margins were so huge that losing almost a third of your inventory was just, the cost of doing business. And that is the economic engine that just keeps this whole thing running.
Okay, so that kind of economic firepower, well, it lets the drug trade go global. So let's zoom out and take a look at the sheer size of this shadow economy and how it's constantly changing to stay alive. These two maps tell such a fascinating story about adaptation. See this on the left? In the 1990s, cocaine was mostly flowing from Colombia up through the Caribbean, a lot of it by air. But as law enforcement started cracking down on those routes, the trade just shifted. The map on the right from 2002 shows that change. Now you see cocaine moving overland, right through Mexico. And at the same time, look at this, new threats are popping up like MDMA or ecstasy, coming into the US through international airports in places like New York. It just goes to show you, these trafficking organizations are anything but static. They are incredibly quick to adapt.
So how much money are we really talking about here? In the late 1990s, the United Nations estimated the global drug trade's annual revenue was a staggering $400 billion. To put that into perspective, that one industry was bigger than the entire economy of many developed countries at the time. But here's the kicker. Where does all that cash go? Well, the UN also figured that only 1%, just a single penny on every dollar spent on the street, ever makes it back to the farmers who actually grew the crops. The other 99 cents, that gets swallowed up by the huge network of traffickers, distributors, and money launderers who get the product to market.
So, faced with this monster of a global business, how did governments fight back? They waged a multi-front war on drugs. Let's break down the main strategies they were using.
Everything changed after the September 11th attacks. The fight against drugs officially merged with the war on terror. The thinking went like this. The enormous profits from drug trafficking were the financial lifeblood for terrorist groups and insurgencies all over the world, from the Taliban in Afghanistan to the FARC rebels in Colombia.
So the official U.S. strategy had 3 main parts, designed to attack the problem from both ends. On the demand side, you had prevention and treatment, which were aimed at reducing the number of people using drugs. And then on the supply side, the goal was to disrupt the market. That's interdiction, crop eradication, all the law enforcement actions to stop drugs from even hitting the street.
But, when you follow the money, you see what the real priority was. This chart breaks down the proposed federal drug budget for 2005. And you can see that even with that 3-part approach, the majority of the funding, 55%, was aimed squarely at disrupting the supply chain. 45% went toward the demand side. So the big question has always been, is it better to choke off the supply of drugs or to reduce the demand for them? The budget at this point was clearly betting on targeting supply.
And trying to disrupt that supply chain, well, that's a whole lot harder in the real world. Take Colombia. For 40 years, there was a civil war. So trying to get rid of coca plants meant going into active conflict zones, often controlled by rebels funded by the very drug money they were trying to stop. Or look at Afghanistan.
After the Taliban fell, a weak central government just couldn't stop regional warlords from using poppy cultivation to fund their own operations. As a result, opium production just exploded.
Okay, so if stopping the drugs themselves is that hard, what about the money? This brings us to the financial front line in the war on drugs.
The whole game here revolves around something called money laundering, and at its heart, it's a pretty simple idea. You're taking all this cash from illegal stuff, like drug sales, and you're making it look like it came from a totally clean, legitimate business.
It's usually a three-step process. First up is placement. That's just getting the physical cash into a bank without setting off alarms. Next is layering. This is where you shuffle the money around through all these complex transactions and different accounts to hide where it actually came from. And finally, you have integration. That's when the now clean money is brought back into the legitimate economy, maybe through real estate, investments, or buying luxury stuff.
And this slide right here really tells the story of the fight against it. It shows the number of suspicious activity reports, or SARs, that banks were filing, and look at that jump. The number of reports for money laundering went from about 35,000 in 1997 all the way up to over 150,000 in 2002. That's a huge increase in financial scrutiny, and it was largely because of new post-9/11 laws like the USA PATRIOT Act, which put a ton of pressure on banks to find and report these kinds of transactions.
And all of this brings us to one final central question. Get this. Some analyses from the time suggested that because the cost to produce drugs are so low and the profits are so high, a trafficker could lose as much as 90% of their product to law enforcement and still make a profit on what was left. And that just forces you to ask, when the economics are that powerful, is a war that's mostly focused on disrupting the supply ever really winnable? It's a question that gets right to the heart of this incredibly complex global problem.